final newsletter for the month of October, you see the debt crisis worsening. I mean, that was essentially a constant theme for the year. You also see more news about proposals to curb, review, restrict investment from the US into China. And then we start November with news about the, pro-China business, the German executives who are quite stressed right now because Berlin is rethinking their China business and China relations overall. So this is another update that if you want to read, you can read that as for free as well if you're interested in learning more about what happened in Berlin at the beginning of the month. It was quite interesting. As the year started to draw towards a close, we just keep seeing additional signs of new legislation that's going to sort of accelerate, maybe not a total decoupling, but it's certainly a partial decoupling, whether that was from the EU-China relationship or within the US-China relationship. We start to get more news about Apple and Apple's troubles in China. There was a massive challenge for Apple at its Foxconn factory in China. What they had tried to do, the managers of Foxconn, probably the local government as well, that complex, the Foxconn complex, is like a 200,000 employee complex. It's enormous. It's a campus with dormitories, with worker dormitories, and a lot of the workers are migrant. Maybe all of them are migrants. Most of them, probably the highest percentage of are migrant workers. And they said what they were trying to do was put everyone in a closed loop system, like Xi Jinping tried to do, or maybe successfully did, at the Beijing Olympics. But somehow it didn't work out quite the same, and COVID was spreading rampantly through that Foxconn technology factory, and it was creating all sorts of chaos and human tragedy. There were videos getting out of people, workers wailing, saying that their friends, their colleagues had died of COVID and no one had come to help them at all. There were videos emerging of people scaling the walls of the compound to try to get to leave. They couldn't get food. It was similar to Shanghai, where something broke down and supplies weren't being distributed or weren't being transported to the compound fast enough, and they weren't able to get food quickly enough or medical supplies. They knew that people were being sent back on the lines, already infected, to work on Apple products, right? This is an absolute nightmare, a reputational risk nightmare for Apple, but it's also a logistics problem for Apple in terms of trying to get that iPhone, the new iPhone 14 out for Christmas sales, right? So any way you look at it, this is not good news for Apple. And we start to see that news of that. It had been happening for several months, I believe, already, but we start to see news of it coming out in November. We also see Safeguard Defenders. I'm so proud of them. They're doing amazing work. Please support what they're doing. Safeguard Defenders is a human rights organization that's headquartered in Madrid, Spain, and they focus on China. They focus on illegal tactics used to incarcerate Chinese political dissidents or even just regular ordinary Chinese citizens abroad. And they have come out with a new report that has really shaken a lot of the West, which is a report. The most recent number I saw was that China had perhaps as many as 100 or more overseas police stations that are potentially operating illegally in countries abroad. So we began to see news of that, and here you see 14 countries are investigating to see whether or not China indeed does have these police stations. If you want to learn more about that, go to Safeguard Defenders. I don't have it here. Let's see, I can type it for you. Safeguard Defenders, police, Chinese police stations. You can go to their website and learn everything you want to know about it. What's happening? My computer is stopped for the moment. Okay. Amazing work they're doing. It truly. So you can read all about it at Safeguard Defenders. And so yes, the Bali summit occurred in about mid-November, and Xi Jinping went from this kind of like curmudgeon personality to like man of the hour. He was whining and dining and meeting with every diplomat and every foreign minister that, you know, he could. It's as if like he had been in hibernation for like 2 or 3 years because he hadn't left China really, and all of a sudden he was he was like international man of the hour. It was unreal. I was just like, for me, it's a sign, you know, if China has to, how do I say this? You can just look at it. It's a historical pattern. If you study the party long enough, you see how they are. Maybe they're arrogant, probably they are arrogant, but they are extremely conscious of face. It's more about face than anything else. And they don't like to be seen to be pandering. They're terrified that they're going to be seen to be pandering to another statesman. So what they do all the time, the top leaders, the ruling elite, is, especially for photo ops and this and that, they try to, you know, appear as if the other statesman in the room is pandering to them because they need to get that photo op in front of their public to show the public how great China is. That, you know, this is all part of their propaganda. So they're not. So basically, you're supposed to come to them. They don't go to you, you come to them. And maybe it does go back to that tributary system. But it really is about showing the public how great China is, that we don't need to travel, they come to us, or whatnot, right? The ruling elite. So it's just such an odd thing that he made the flip so quickly. And for me, it indicates that the party is quite desperate. They're so desperate. They're willing to lose a little face, right? Because they'll get something bigger in return, with whatever that is. I think that I already mentioned this, but I think that they are extremely desperate about the economy and the COVID that is exploding as he's in Bali. And so he's trying to reignite some of the deals that he had ignored or just, I don't know, left for another day, to try to kickstart something that would help the economy start to turn upward. That's my take on it. You can read that update. It's not locked. Why Xi Jinping might not be backpedaling on, well, what did I know? So they just totally got rid of it, right? But I still make an argument here. The argument is that they always plan to reopen, but they were waiting for the right time, and the right time was when the economy was nearly at its, had nearly collapsed, but most certainly after Xi had clinched his third term. So if they had always planned to reopen as soon or very quickly thereafter Xi clinched his third term, when there was less political risk to him and his cronies in the party, then it's not really backpedaling, is it? The U.S. military may be returning to Subic Bay in the Philippines. Now, this is not an official announcement. I think this came out of the Kyoto News. This is an English newspaper, or it's a newspaper in Japan, but they have an English language version. And they interviewed or got word from various local officials in Subic Bay who said that American embassy officials had been to Subic Bay to look at some of those, it's a port, it's a deep water port, and the signs were that they were interested in coming back, and that the local area was interested in them coming back. The local officials also were interested in that, and so nothing has been officially announced, but that's what's coming out in the news from local Philippine officials, and yeah, so we'll see. But that would be pretty darn historic. The U.S. military used to be based in Subic Bay in the Philippines, and they abandoned that base. I think it was like 20 years ago. Not sure exactly. Can't remember. Let's see. After 30 years. So that story is unlocked, as is another story about the Chinese fast fashion group Shein, which is exploiting apparently a legal loophole to import Xinjiang cotton to the U.S. And then the head story here is for November, the end of November, the FCC bans all Chinese telecom equipment in this historic national security decision. So again, more legislation. 2022 was the year of legislation. There were some moves in 2021, but 2022 really saw a lot of stuff happening there. So if you would like to read that, that would be on the 28th of November, and it's there's no paywall for that. Now, at the end of the month, we start getting word. At the time, we had no idea of the scale, right? But we began to get word out of China that there were these protests, zero COVID, anti-zero COVID protests happening in several cities. And some of them even were demanding that Xi Jinping step down. It was just trickling out at this time. We had no idea how significant they would be, and that ultimately, China would reverse its zero COVID policy. But here you see in my Middle Kingdom Surreal column that I have in my newsletter, it's usually about things that are just crazy, surreal or absurd, or they may not happen anywhere else, or if they do, there's certainly a Chinese twist to it. It's very unusual stuff that comes out out from China, Chinese news, that sort of thing. At this time, I was trying to figure out which cities that these protests were taking place in. We knew that they had somehow started probably on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing, and then they spread to like Wuhan, where the pandemic first began. I think they ended up taking place in something like 17 or 19 cities across China. They weren't in just, certain regions or anything like that. There were a lot of protests on university campuses. You see here in this video, they were holding up white pieces of paper reminiscent of the Hong Kong protests. Now that is Xi Jinping's worst nightmare, right? The whole reason that he implemented the 2020 national security law in Hong Kong was to clamp everybody down, because he was terrified. The ruling party, China, the Communist Party, is terrified of those protests from Hong Kong spreading to the mainland, right? So they managed to stop them from spreading to the mainland at that point. But a lot of these younger protesters, they're going to have access to VPNs, and they're going to know about the Hong Kong protests, and probably many of them sympathize, and so ultimately they ended up citing some of the, chanting some of the same slogans that Hong Kongers did during their protests, and holding up these blank sheets of paper at universities in Beijing and Nanjing to express frustrations with COVID restrictions and government censorship. That was pretty amazing. We found out that the BBC had one of its journalists who had been beaten and kicked by police after being arrested at the protest in Shanghai. So yes, that can happen. And why did the protests start? Well, it's 3 very long years of draconian lockdowns that have just got people, seething and stressed. I mean, they have to take time off from work. Maybe they'll get paid, maybe they won't. They stress out about their pets if they're infected. You've seen the images of their pets being killed. You've seen the images of parents. I've shown you images of parents being separated from children. And it seems that what happened to maybe spark this mass nationwide protest was it was like the last straw. There was a deadly apartment fire in Xinjiang's regional capital, Xinjiang, the western province that we're all talking about with respect to forced labor issues and the Uyghurs who are oppressed. So in Xinjiang, there was a deadly apartment fire in which people were showing video of victims in the burning building who were unable to escape because of locked doors and other COVID-0, types of controls. There was an image of a fire truck and ambulances who could not get to the apartment building because of COVID-0 barricades around it. So essentially, people just across, when these images came out, they went viral before the Chinese government could censor them. They were, who knows how long they had been spreading, but they spread themselves like fire. I mean, spread very quickly. and people just empathized and identified with the risks and the safety issues and the stress and how COVID-0 is killing every bit as much as it's preventing death, you know. And so that is what we believe sparked the nationwide mass, since Tiananmen, unprecedented scale of protests in China. And it's still very difficult to wrap your mind around, because this just doesn't happen in China. You don't go out on the streets in defiance of local orders to lock down. You know, you're risking arrest right there. Removing all the barriers that the authorities have put up. Whether sometimes they removed them peacefully, sometimes it was very violent. You don't do that. You don't criticize Xi Jinping and say "xia tai," you know, step down. These are not things that you do in China. And you can see some of the chaos here. Of course, I know you've seen it. Everybody around the world has watched in awe at these images, and I'm you know, a little bit speechless over it. I've been able to talk about it with you, but it's quite moving to think about how stressed you have to be, how frustrated you have to be to risk your own freedom, your life, with such a brutal authoritarian government who, you know, won't show you any mercy, especially if you're the organizer of one of these protests. So there's an interview. Selena Wong did a great interview with one of the protesters. He was an organizer. It makes me nervous because I just don't. She did it in China. Of course, they hid his identity, but I don't, you know, I'm sure the Chinese government is going to want to know who he is, and they're going to want to find out from Selena Wong one of these days. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but at least you could probably Google it. I don't know. Maybe I can help you find it if you want to see it. But she did an interview with one of the organizers, and he was a very eloquently spoken individual who talked about freedom and democracy, but he said really this was about just ending zero COVID for now. But it was interesting because he did give you the sense that the young and maybe even the old of China haven't completely forgotten about their own personal interest and their own personal rights. Of course they haven't. But it hasn't been, you know, just because Beijing was able to remove references to individual rights and values that are synonymous with democratic values. You know, I use the word democracy, but it's really, democracy is just a set of values, and I feel that they are universal. So you can argue that all day long if you want with me, but if I stop calling it democracy and I just call it a certain set of values, I understand that there are traditional cultures. I get that quite clearly. I'm from one. But that has not, yeah, I know I'm American, but I'm also from East Tennessee, Appalachia. So that does not mean that traditional values clash with individual rights. And the Chinese have a sense, and have always had a sense of individual rights, right? They were willing to 吃苦, eat bitter, for a very, very long time because there was economic gain to be had out of it. But it seems that they may not be willing to do that anymore, and that's really what's so riveting about these protests. At the beginning of this month, we saw just a little controversy between Europe and the US over Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which the Europeans are afraid is going to pull investment money from Europe into the U.S. And so the U.S. is doing this at the same time. It's putting pressure on European companies to comply with these forced labor and also semiconductor export restrictions, export controls. So we see a little hiccup here in European and U.S. relations. There was a report about the Dutch Prime Minister pushing back, or the Dutch Trade Minister in a speech at The Hague pushed back against U.S. controls on China's semiconductor tech. But I think they're trying to work that out. So the last thing I've heard about any of this is that they're trying to work through the differences. And it's not as if it's going to completely disrupt EU-US relations so far. That's what I think is happening, the status so far. More news on Apple. And then there's this great story out of The Wire China about Steve Wynn. Steve Wynn is the Las Vegas, casino mogul who got in pretty cozy in Macau, but maybe he got too cozy with some of the Chinese money and power in Macau. And so it's a very good story. You should read it. Let's see what it was. It came from, her name again is Katrina Northrup, The Wire China. Fantastic story. I don't think there was a paywall. I don't think there's a paywall for this story because I was able to read this story. It's a very good story. So yeah, I don't have a subscription to The Wire China. I have a lot of subscriptions, but not to this one. And for some reason, I don't know, I didn't see a paywall. I was able to read it. So this is a fascinating story, and so I did an update on the problems of overexposure to China. And I first talked about Apple, right? And I've already told you what's happening with Apple. Then we talk about Steve Wynn, and yeah, so I don't want to go into all the details. It's fascinating, but he's in some trouble. So you can read that. December the 9th is the story. Finally, towards the end of the year, we get news that the Taiwanese firm TSMC, the semiconductor firm that is worrying, the security of which is worrying Taiwan and U.S. and the world in light of Beijing's constant threat to Taiwan, because these guys produce the largest number of most advanced semiconductors in the industry. They are tripling their U.S. investment. Now, they had already planned a chip plant. I think their first chip plant was planned for Arizona also. They tripled that original investment, and they're going to do a second chip plant. And this has been heralded by the industry. It's been heralded by Washington and heralded by, their customers like Apple. Apple, AMD, NVIDIA will be the first customers buying these chips from TSMC's Arizona plant. And this was such a big deal. I mean, NVIDIA CEO said that bringing TSMC investment to the United States is a masterstroke and a game-changing development for the industry. And a number of people showed up at the opening ceremony. Tim Cook was there, other industry titans, and President Biden was there. So that should tell you something right there. So people are quite excited. It's seen as a victory for Washington and in Washington's tech war with China. At least at least on one, it's a the tech war is ongoing. It doesn't completely end the tech war, of course, but it's certainly seen as a major battle won to secure semiconductor supply chains for U.S. supply chains, U.S. Companies, but also for European companies, because they use the same supply chains and the rest of the world. And my final story of the year was some analysis and digging around on why China-Indian clashes seem to be increasing along that contested border in the Himalayas. So I found new research in the news that was very telling. Over the past couple of weeks, so there were two reports of India-China border clashes that we didn't know about before. One actually occurred, I think, earlier in December, and then the other occurred in 2021, late fall. So these were previously unreported clashes that sort of surprised everyone. And then some researchers out of Northwestern University and the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands and the Netherlands Defense Academy issued a report of their findings that China's PLA incursions across India's west and central borders are strategically planned. They use geospatial analysis to show this. So they're not random accidents. They are planned to take certain pieces of the border. So here, one of the lead researchers out of Northwestern says, by studying the number of incursions that occurred in the west and middle sectors over time, it became obvious to them statistically that these incursions are not random. The probability of randomness is very low, he says, which suggests to us that it's a coordinated effort. When we looked at the eastern sector, there's much weaker evidence for coordination. So what it's saying, what the research is showing, is that China really wants that western part of the border. I think that's called the, the region is called... this one, Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. It's that region that China seems to be going after. There was another report about the same time that came out in the Fair Observer that explains one reason that China might want that area, and it's because of a city in the area that is very symbolic for Tibetan Buddhism. So the Taiwan is the name of the city, and the Chinese government seems to clash over that area more frequently. And the idea is because right now we're at a point in time where the Dalai Lama is aging, and the Tibetan government in exile is in need of his successor. And China, Beijing, is trying to control who succeeds him so that they can control Tibetans' loyalties. So here the report says the current Dalai Lama is now 87 and the question of succession looms. The Tibetans and CCP are clashing over this question. Note that no Dalai Lama has emerged outside the traditional Tibetan homeland, and that I guess it's Tawang. I don't know how it's pronounced. It's not a Chinese word. It would be probably Tibetan language, I assume. Anyway, China sees this village or city as part of Tibet, but it's on India's side of the border. And so they want it because it's very, very symbolically important to Tibetan Buddhists. Here the report says Taiwan is the only important center of this homeland outside Chinese control. For many Tibetans, it is desirable that the tradition of Tibetan succession continue as it normally does. As many lamas have mentioned to the authors writing this report, the next Dalai Lama could emerge from the Taiwan area, and Beijing wants to avoid such a possibility. That's the idea. That is one reason that they may want this area more than another area along the border. So